Welcome back to the Clever Cow podcast, where we discuss innovative ideas and work to create a more sustainable dairy industry. This podcast is brought to you by the University of Idaho ISAID grant. ISAID stands for Idaho Sustainable Agriculture Initiative for Dairy, and it is a $10 million grant awarded by the USDA to develop sustainable and economical dairy manure solutions. I'm your host, Savanah Nunes, the ISAID Director of Media and Communications. Today, we have a special treat for you as we dive deep into the economics of sustainable dairy innovations. Joining us is Dr. Hernan Tejeda, ISAID Grant Economist and University of Idaho Associate Professor and Extension Specialist. In this episode, we will discuss the pressures facing the dairy industry to become more sustainable, the economics of ISAID's biodegradable plastic made from manure, trends and consumer preferences affecting the dairy industry, dairy carbon credits, how they work, and their incentives and risks. Lastly, we will discuss the first steps dairymen can take if they are interested in making their dairy more sustainable. Get ready for an enlightening conversation that's sure to leave you inspired and informed. Grab your headphones, sit back, and let's get this episode started. Welcome, Dr. Tejeda.
Thank you very much, Savanah, and thank you very much for having me. As you mentioned, I'm an associate professor, extension specialist in dairy and livestock economics, more or less since 2016. So I'm going into my eighth year, and it's really nice and a wonderful time to be here because of the opportunities to do research and educate.
Awesome. Well, happy to have you on. I kind of wanted to get started with talking about some pressures that are facing the dairy industry. So I'm curious, what economic factors are driving the increasing pressure on the dairy industry to become more sustainable?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And there are, a myriad of different factors. So starting from the market, consumers, especially younger ones, are more demanding of products that have a relation to the environment. And so they're more concerned about the environment, in this sense, carbon footprint, recyclable materials, etc. And so that has a direct relation with the dairy industry and how they produce milk. And so also there's food and company retailers who are starting to pay attention to the demand from consumers and are also seeking in their operations to obtain inputs that are more sustainable. On another hand, there's regulations also from different administrations or entities that are storing regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, on water usage, on waste management, on energy usage. And also there's the factor of risk management in terms of environmental hazards from climate change, which will have an effect on feed supply, water shortage, etc. So there's a lot of different economic factors that are having an effect on the dairy industry to become more sustainable.
So you mentioned a little bit about consumer demands and regulations. How do those impact the economic decisions of dairy producers?
Yeah, excellent. So they affect the dairy operations because the dairy producers have to evaluate incorporating new practices into their operations or new equipment or new methods that specifically address these consumer demands or the regulation demands. So in incorporating these new practices like handling waste management or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or it could be also animal welfare. Always the producers have to economically evaluate what this will translate into their economic operations.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've personally seen a big shift towards it. A lot of people my age are starting to go more towards the climate friendly stuff, even more like grass fed milk. My family's dairy, Nunes Family Dairy, we sell our milk to Glambia,
Mhm.
and they're actually incentivizing dairy producers to even go grass fed. And I think they're paying like an extra $2 or something.
That's very well, I would say, mentioned, very, very pertinent.
So when it comes to sustainable practices on a dairy, what are some key economic challenges that dairy producers face?
I mean, right off the bat, challenges are they have to dive into investing in the new costly technologies. So this will require capital costs, which have not been considered previously. At the same time, the implementation of those technologies, so they might have to train personnel, etc. So all these are economic challenges that will have to be taken into consideration. At the same time, operational costs, new feeds, water systems, operations that have to be or that would be in compliance with milk buyers or processors. And so all those are challenges that will affect economically the operation of the dairy farm.
So, what about the economic opportunities that dairy producers face when it comes to sustainable practices?
Yes. So there, right off the bat, there is the possibility of price premium, as mentioned. Processors are willing to benefit the dairy producers who are implementing sustainable practice. So they will pay a price premium for the milk. But also, there are opportunities of saving economically in the rather long term, like less water usage, like less energy, in the waste management. If it's a sustainable practice, you have to less labor intensive or other means. And lastly, also there's the opportunity to differentiate with other producers who might not be adopting these practices. And so other folks who want to buy your milk that had not done that before because you are implementing these practices. So those are another opportunity.
On the topic of opportunities,
Mhm.
so with the ISAID grant, from what I understand, your main position is basically breaking down the economic side of the biodegradable plastic. How does the biodegradable plastic made from manure work economically, and what are its potential benefits for dairy producers?
Okay, so that's a really good question. In researching that topic, the one relevant matter that is being difficult to put a finger on is the cost of production. That is still being investigated because there are trials, etc. But from there to actually having the product reach the retail for consumer is something that has not been fully solved. And yet the benefits of it is that there will be a new income stream for producers once that is enabled. You will have with that the possibility of spreading out your income so you'll have greater risk management, not just relying on milk, but also on the output from your waste being processed there. And again, you may be able to sell milk to other buyers because they will tap into this sustainable practice that you are implementing or undertaking.
I guess I'm kind of curious about what we think this will look like. A facility in the Magic Valley that basically goes and picks up manure from dairymen, and then they take it there and like process it and turn it into plastic, and then they get like a certain premium for it, or they buy their manure. Is that kind of
There are two things. One is the production of the biodegradable plastic per se from the manure, which you alluded that would different manures be transported to one place and then the biodegradable plastic produced, and then perhaps the income from the sale of that would be allotted to each dairy producer? That might well be a possibility as a hub, or big dairies could just have their own production process
yeah.
in their own dairy. And yet, at the same time, the production process right now for the big scale to make it 24/7 production of biodegradable plastic at an industry level, the costs have not been fully, as far as I know, fine tuned.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, we talked a little bit in the last episode about they were wanting to implement machine learning, like an AI that feeds the bacteria, basically.
Mhm.
So that would cut down on labor at least. But
Right.
there's a lot of other factors to consider.
Right. And that's still at the prototype level.
Yeah.
In moving it to the full realm of already available to, switch, turn on the light. Okay, the manure is going in and into the box or black box, and then the biodegradable plastics coming out at an industry scale is still being developed. So when you say, how does it work economically? The numbers for the industry scale are still being worked on, to have the product out. What a colleague of I have been studying what would be folks maybe willing to pay and what are uses of that biodegradable plastic. What are uses? So, like mulch in crops or different plant pots. You can put the plant on a biodegradable pot, etc. But right now, as I mentioned, the economic feasibility from a cost wise perspective of taking the manure and delivering the biodegradable plastic in order to produce these either mulch type from biodegradable plastic or a pot for plants is still in development.
Personally, like as an economist,
Mhm.
what would you like to see happen to kind of move this along
Yeah.
into the industry more?
Certainly, the production process has to be humming, operating. So right now, it's still at a stage where it's being developed, but it's not, humming. So let me just give you a parallel example. When you're developing a new engine, you're still testing it, you're still, fine tuning it, and a few years later, okay, it's ready to be mass produced.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it's still not yet mass produced. And so economically, we need to have the full engineering set that it says, okay, this could be mass produced. Okay, but what were the steps taken and what was the economic evaluation for each of those steps to make it feasible? Now, from a market perspective, we have been tapping onto how much would the general public be willing to pay for this biodegradable product from manure versus this non-biodegradable product. And so that is, willingness to pay. And there are already some findings that consumers are willing to pay a premium. However, translating that into the covering costs of the production side has still not calculated the cost in order to have it at a industry scale production. So it has to meet. Both sides have to meet. So the demand, we're having a good idea, but the supply of it is still being worked on.
Just kind of like a ballpoint guess.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think consumer demand for sustainable dairy products affects the pricing and market dynamics for producers?
Well, so yeah, that's a great question. So demand for sustainable dairy is at the crux of the matter because you can supply anything, but if nobody demands it, you see, but the demand is growing. Demand is growing. Now, not only consumer demand, but from processors' perspective, it's also growing. And when I say that, the processors, Glambia, etc.,
Giving an incentive like the $2
right,
premium, I guess.
premium,
Yeah.
yeah, in order to enable dairy producers to conduct sustainable dairy practices. And in those sustainable dairy practices, enabling the manufacture of biodegradable products or nutrients, basically is handling the waste management, which is a piece of a sustainable practice. The demand from consumers for dairy products that have sustainable practice is growing. As consumers become more aware of the sustainable practices that dairy producers are implementing, there will be increased interest in the products. Right now, the newer consumers are very demanding of environmental and they've gone into a little bit of plant-based products just because they've been bombarded with information regarding non-sustainable practices. But as dairy producers go into these, I think the consumers will be brought back, those young consumers. There's no substitute for the nutritional aspects of dairy. All these plant-based are non-natural. They are lab grown, and so which is a totally different product. Yeah, the nutrition aspect of milk in itself is highly superior to plant beverages, which have to artificially include these nutrients in order to make them comparable.
Yeah, from what I've understood too, they've been unable to replicate like the creaminess. That's been something like the
Yeah, I wouldn't
plant-based
doubt it.
industry has been
Yeah,
struggling with for
yeah,
years.
yeah. Well, one thing that I do know, and if I may, and you may know it, is that milk, the texture of it includes all the nutrition in the liquid itself. The plant beverages, all the nutrients are at the bottom because they've been incorporated. So they have to shake this beverage in order to include all the nutrients in the liquid. In other words, they go to the bottom.
I had no idea about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, they do.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So again, demand from consumers there's been increasing demand from consumers for environmental friendly products. And as the dairy producers increase their implementation of sustainable practice, and that information is provided to these consumers, demand for the dairy products will be increasing.
So there's been a lot of talk about carbon credits with the dairy industry. I guess explain it to the people listening. What are dairy carbon credits and how do they function?
Carbon offsets or offsets reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with dairy farming activities. So basically, these are certificates that are tradable. And so, but in order to be tradable, these have to be first measured and verified. The reduction of the emission of the greenhouse gas emission has to be measured and verified. It has to be quantified and certified. And then you obtain these certificates, which you can sell or trade. So that's what these carbon credits are.
So the dairy producer basically makes a change on their dairy that's more sustainable, and then they get this credit
Certificate.
certificate,
Yeah, which credits. Yeah.
and then they basically use that certificate to do they give that to the state if there's
They
like
can trade.
regulations or
Yeah,
something?
they can trade it. They can sell it off as an offset or an inset to another company. So if
Oh, yeah. So
Mhm,
I think this was discussed, right? So say there's like a big corporate company,
mhm,
and basically the corporate company makes a pledge that they're carbon neutral, net zero, or
mhm,
whatever. And then down the supply chain,
mhm,
that would influence all of the basically the entire supply chain,
yeah,
which the dairy producers would be at the beginning of.
yes,
And they would make a change on their dairy, and then they could sell that carbon credit back up to that beginning company that made the pledge. Is that
yep,
how it
yep.
works?
That's pretty much how it works. Now, two things. One, actually, the dairy farm is at the beginning, but also the feed they buy. So, or they produce. But in terms of how they sell it, if the company is outside of the supply chain, let's say it was aircraft or a car company, then the selling of that would be an offset to that company buying it.
Yeah.
But if it's a dairy related company, a big dairy related company, then the selling of that would be an inset.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you see? The trade of it would be a carbon inset.
Yeah. So it'd have to be dairy related for it to be an inset.
Yes.
And then like McDonald's or something, if they said that. And so that would somehow, or the milk that they're getting to, or their ice cream to their consumers,
Yeah.
basically, if they made that pledge, then that would be an inset
Yes.
because the dairymen would be in that same supply chain.
Yes.
But some like clothing company, Abercrombie and Finch, for example,
Okay.
if they did the carbon neutral thing,
Mhm.
they could literally just pledge that and then basically buy those credits,
Mhm.
and then that would negate whatever they're producing, right?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I like to use real world
Yeah,
examples
no,
because it really helps me
Yeah.
learn.
And when they would buy that carbon credit, it would be an offset.
So, what incentives do carbon credits offer for dairy farmers?
So one is it would be like, of course, a new income stream, which is different than the milk production, and at the same time that would be sort of a risk management item because the income stream would be different than the prices of milk.
Yeah, so it's kind of nice because you can get money from two sources instead of having all your eggs in one basket and
Exactly.
being more dependent on the
Exactly.
milk.
You're hedging a little.
Yeah, definitely.
And at the same time, you can have access to funding or incentive programs that are wanting this to be promoted. So there's three income streams. One is the carbon credit, which you can sell as an offset or as an inset. The other one is the incentive or funding in order to decrease that. But those are two carbon credit offers in itself. And the other one is the reduction of emissions. If you produce renewable gas, you can get an income stream from the federal government. And if you reduce your emissions and produce renewable electricity, you cannot get it from the federal, but if you're in Washington, Oregon, and California, you could get from there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But at the federal level, it doesn't exist yet. So what's the difficulty for Idaho? We cannot tap yet on that electricity, renewable energy, because we're not in Washington, California, and Oregon. And at the federal level, the ERIN has not been approved yet.
Do you think that's on the horizon? Maybe next 10 years or something?
Yeah. In the next 10 years, it should. Yeah. So it depends on the administrations, how they go about the environment. But since consumers are demanding more and more, there would be, I would say, most plausible an effort to go about in that direction.
So when it comes to carbon credit programs, is there any economic risk associated with participating in them?
Yes. Yeah. So first, there's a volatility of the prices of these renewable energy markets. Carbon credit programs, what they do is they provide certificates so that other companies can maintain their level of emissions and use the credit from the dairy producer who has lowered their emissions. But the price of those certificates is not set in stone.
Oh, so they change depending on the market
It evolves.
and the swing of
demand and supply.
Demand, yeah.
Yeah. So that makes it, a little challenging.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
But at least no matter what, they'd still be selling their milk. So
yeah,
obviously it's just kind of a backup.
Well, it's a new income stream, which can be large or it can be small.
Yeah.
It can be small, and so you have to be aware of that risk. The other one is regulations. So some regulations have not come into play, and so you might do a carbon credit program, and then there's stiffer regulations. So you have to decrease even more. Or, you have to go into new credit for new emission, new type of emissions.
Is it like one of those things where to get the carbon credit, you have to stay ahead of the regulations? Like you have to be doing more than what the minimum regulation requires? The regulations, I don't know, sustainable practices get stricter and stricter. To get that carbon credit, you'd be having to do even more sustainable practices than what the minimum is of the regulation.
Well, you have to be prepared.
Yeah.
You would have to be prepared. So let's say you invest, also capital cost. You invest in this sustainable practice to meet the regulation. That's not there yet, but it might be there. But then there comes a new regulation, which is, like you say, more demanding, more stiffer. So then you would have to add on a capital cost or cost to meet that regulation. So those are risks that, okay, if you went into the first one, then you'd have to go into the second one. And it wasn't just the first one that left you all set. Conversely, you could wait for the first and second one and just go into the both of them, but you don't know when the second one may come.
Yeah.
And you would lose the benefit of having gone in the first one and all the benefits from it. Premium in milk price, perhaps, also being able to sell the carbon credits, etc. So there's a trade-off.
I mean, I think it could be hard because if you think about it, you're installing this technology, you're making these changes on your dairy, and how long can that last for the credit to continue, for the investment to actually get it back? Or does the government help you build that technology on your dairy, or no matter what, the dairyman has to invest in it? And then if the carbon credit doesn't pay off, then it's a loss. I mean,
yeah, no, certainly. And so there is where you have to assess or take into consideration. There might be federal incentive, there might be state incentive, but at the same time, there might be the processor buying your milk might give you an incentive, not only with a premium in the milk price, but also perhaps a loan for acquiring this equipment, technology. So there are different incentives that have to be taken into consideration. But at the same time, there is also risk of new regulations, of new demands. So there's a lot of trade-offs that have to be weighted.
Definitely. It's one of those things, it can be hard to know where to start for dairymen. I think it can be confusing and costly to make sustainable decisions. What do you think are the first steps that you would suggest for people who are interested in learning more and making the change?
Yeah, so I would first dive into learning, reading, basically gaining education on the different sustainable practices, on climate smart practices that could be implemented, talking with your dairy peers all over. What have they done? What have they not done? What have they considered? Folks who might be a little ahead of the curve than you currently are. You also want to measure carbon footprint of your farm. So there are some programs out there available from USDA where it can give you an idea of where your operation stands. You want to check with your loan officers, what are your financials, what are the available investment possibilities for different technologies. Of course, you'd want to have learned about different technologies through sustainable practices, sustainable technology, climate smart practices. You want to start small always. You don't want to start big. Financial is
Kind of
very
dip your
important.
toe in a little bit.
Yeah, just go, step by step, but also definitely keeping all the information at hand from the financial side, from the operational side, from the equipment, technology side, and also all the legal side, what it entails what. And also with who you're selling milk to, because they may most probably be interested in you as a dairy producer dipping into these practices, because at the same time they're able to promote that their dairy products have been processed with milk that has sustainable practices. There are many different aspects, but learn, educate yourself, connect with experts, consultants, university folks. This is not a one path, straight path. It's addressing many different.
Well, I mean, it's such a complex issue and thing that the world is undertaking, this path to be more sustainable.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard, and there's not going to be a one size fits all thing. There's many farms, both small and large, that are going to need different solutions to this.
Yep.
And I think just from what I've heard around Dairy West or IDA, they have different grant opportunities to try out different technologies on your dairy, and there's a lot less risk associated with that. So there's different options, and as the research and the science continues to progress, I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel for sure.
Oh, certainly, certainly. This is a whole industry approach, the whole dairy industry, milk producers, processors, wholesalers, retailers are in this endeavor. And the reason is because demand has been growing for these sort of practices. This is something that there's a commitment at Zero Initiative. So yeah, I don't see this going away.
Thank you, Dr. Tejeda, for taking the time to tell us more about the economics of sustainable dairy innovations. It's been incredible to hear your insights on the financial aspects of biodegradable plastics, carbon credits, and the many challenges and opportunities within the dairy industry. I want to thank you all for joining us for this enlightening episode of the Clever Cow podcast. To stay updated on our latest episodes and all things related to the ISAID grant, be sure to follow us on social media. We release new episodes every month, and we also welcome your questions and comments. Your feedback is invaluable as we explore the future of sustainable dairy together. Thanks again for listening to the Clever Cow podcast. Until next time, stay curious and keep supporting sustainable dairy practices.